Imagine an electric railroad that once stretched over 180 miles from Oakland to Chico, California. That would be this Sacramento Northern that ended in a tiny yard in a cramped residential area. Be sure to like and subscribe and check into our website at cspmovies.com. And thanks for watching.
The Sacramento Northern was owned by the Western Pacific. The SN was bought in the 1920s as a feeder line and as an alternate route into Oakland. Passenger operation ended in 1940, but the SN was always cooperative with rail fans. This was one of the many fan trips over the SN. It was recorded on 8mm movie film by the late Harry DeMoro when he was 15. Harry went on to a long career as a journalist, historian, and photographer. You can see his early work here on a June 1954 fan trip organized by the Bay Area Electric Railroad Association. The trip started in the small SN yard in Oakland at 40th and Shafter. The trip ran to the end of the Pittsburgh branch with a short trip to the rail ferry slip at Mallard. The return trip was from Mallard back to Oakland. The SN used electric freight motors to haul daily freight trains between Oakland and West Pittsburgh. Several SN freight motors were leased to the Oakland terminal. They ran down the Key Systems tracks to the OT yard and the Oakland Army base. The OT was owned by the Key System until World War II, when it was sold to the WP and the Santa Fe. Notice the extra-large pantograph on leased number 442 to reach the Key Systems higher catenary under the SP underpass on the way to the Key Systems bridge yard. The green line is SN's track to its 40th and Shafter yard, tied to the Key Systems 40th Street line. The Oakland terminal freights used the streetcar line as a connection to the freight yard. The SN trains used Shafter Avenue crossing College Avenue for a run up into Rock Ridge. Passing by Lake Temescal, the tracks ran through Montclair and Shepherd Canyon to a long tunnel. The SN yard was energized to 600 volts DC to match that of the connecting Key Systems voltage on their 40th Street line. 2 blocks up Shafter Avenue, the SN voltage was raised to 1500 volts DC to deal with the steeper grades ahead. These 2 SN motors have ended their westward run into Oakland, and they dropped their pantographs to tie up in the small SN yard. Before the fan trip left, Harry caught a leased OT freight motor running a short way up Shafter Avenue to back a single Pennsylvania Railroad boxcar into the small Sacramento Northern yard. The OT's connections to the area's Army and naval bases kept this part of the SN busy during the 3-year Korean War. Number 442 was built in 1920 and scrapped by 1955. It looks like freight traffic is rather thin today. The boost in traffic from the Korean War was already over by this June 1954 fan trip day. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, almost a year before. This fan trip used a 1913 vintage Hall Scott. It was formerly number 1020 when the SN had passenger service. It was originally built as a trailer, but motorized by 1915. Several passenger units were kept for maintenance of way use after passenger service ended in 1940. The trip was arranged for SN fans by the Bay Area Electric Railroad Association, still active today. We leave the 40th and Shafter yard and station to head up Shafter Avenue. The homeowners along Shafter never cared much for the trains, and they were eager to see the line disappear from their otherwise quiet residential setting. The tracks were completed into Oakland by 1913, when it was far less developed. The southern half of the SN was known as the Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern back then. The OA&E was reorganized in 1920 as the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroad Company. By 1928, the line was bought by the Western Pacific and merged with the Northern Electric to form the Sacramento Northern Railway. Most of SN's trackage was on private right-of-way. The stretch from Rock Ridge to Oakland on a city street was an unfortunate thorn in everyone's side. The cramped yard at 40th and Shafter was going to be replaced by a larger one in Rock Ridge on a vacant field. This plan never materialized due to shaky finances in the early years of the OA&E. The grade here reaches beyond the 4% mark in spots as we head toward Lake Temescal. We duck under Broadway near the edge of Lake Temescal. Long freight trains heading timetable east often had to double the hill back in Rock Ridge and reassemble the train at Temescal siding due to the steep ruling grade. SN freights were required to have a locomotive at both ends of all trains, even if only a single boxcar and caboose. This was to prevent a car from uncoupling and racing back down Shafter Avenue out of control. It happened once in the early years before the rule was set. MW 302 crosses Snake Road with Montclair Village in the background. The tracks curve through a great excavation in the hillside to approach Shepherd Canyon. We'll parallel Park Boulevard until we near Saroni Drive. There, the tracks enter a 3,200-foot-long tunnel. Around the middle of the tunnel, the train will leave Alameda County and enter Contra Costa County. This tunnel was built into a hillside that naturally drained an abundance of water out the east end. This was one of the nuisances to live with. The east side was called Eastport. It had the substation that fed the western half of the south end. The next substation was at Concord. Here we see MW 302 leaving the east end of the tunnel in a photo run by. Eastport had a collection of small structures and a number of fruit trees planted by SN's workers. Parked off to the left of the track is one of SN's tower cars to work on the overhead catenary wiring. When the line closed in 1957, the Eastport clearing was soon engulfed with brush and vegetation, making this a difficult place to reach. The tracks paralleled Pinehurst Road into Redwood Canyon. The Redwood Canyon was a popular picnic site for the old OA&E passenger trains in the early years. The tracks continue out past Pinehurst, where they crossed over Canyon Road on a small trestle on the way to Valley Vista. Less than a mile further east, the tracks crossed again, but this time under Canyon Road. This was shot from the small bridge that once ran over the tracks. Just past Moraga, we can see part of the huge pear orchard in the distance. We run by St. Mary's College with its small mission-style station. In this 1954 scene, it was still standing after passenger trains had ended in 1940. The distance from St. Mary's to Lafayette is about 4.3 miles. We pass by a siding at a long-neglected station at Lafayette. It once loaded milk, produce, and passengers in an earlier era. 5.5 miles later and past the town of Walnut Creek, we reach Las Juntas, where the Sacramento Northern crossed and occasionally interchanged freight with the Southern Pacific. This very rare chance moment meeting was also a photo in James Harrison's recent Sacramento Northern Gallery book. This movie film shot angle is the matching photo scene in the book. SP had the priority at this crossing junction since SP had been there from 1891. Long before the OA&E built their tracks across SP rails. The SP's San Ramon branch ran through San Ramon and Walnut Creek to Avon, halfway between Martinez and Port Chicago. One thing you'll notice is the fine maintenance of Sacramento Northern's track. This is remarkable since only one freight train in each direction per day was the norm in the last few years on the SN's Oakland to Walnut Creek section. The Sacramento Northern operation from Oakland out to a point near Walnut Creek closed in 1957 after the WP made new connections with the Oakland terminal down Union Street back in Oakland. This eliminated transferring Western Pacific freight cars bound for the Oakland Army Base at WP's Sacramento Yard to the Sacramento Northern for the trip through the Oakland Hills on the SN line. The SN carried out operations from its Pittsburgh yard to Walnut Creek and its agricultural sidings for a few more years, but this was an all-diesel operation by then. The catenary all came down on the south end in March 1957. By 1964, the main line from Walnut Creek to Concord was sold to the Bay Area Rapid Transit Operation, known as BART. You might be astonished by the underdeveloped look of all this territory of about a half-century ago. At Clyde, we crossed the Bay Point and Clayton, a short line around the Port Chicago area. The SN's tracks turned east at Port Chicago and ran past McAvoy, where the SN paralleled the SP and the Santa Fe. A stop there is just in time to record the Santa Fe San Francisco Chief. This post-World War II train is a technological contrast to our 1913 vintage Hall Scott car. Sacramento Northern crossed under the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads to head toward its ferry slip at Mallard. The ferry connection across the Suisun Bay was eliminated in 1954, about the time of this filming. From then on, a trackage rights arrangement with the Santa Fe connected SN trains to Stockton. All this was precipitated by the 1951 collapse of the long arcade trestle on the other side of the Suisun Bay. The trestle was rebuilt, but without electric overhead. The line from Chips to Sacramento was dieselized. This left the Contra Costa and Alameda County line an isolated electric section. By 1954, the ferry was retired from service. The trackage rights over Santa Fe to Stockton and the WP to Sacramento reconnected the south end segment to the rest of the Sacramento Northern. The SN predecessor, Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern, never really made it to Antioch or east of there either. Antioch is just east of East Pittsburgh. The early franchise expired before available resources could lay rails into Antioch. Actually, it was a blunder that haunted the OANE's management. Once the trackage rights were secured over the Santa Fe, the Sacramento Northern trains finally made it to Antioch, but as a guest on someone else's rails. The Western Pacific line from Oakland to Sacramento took a roundabout route to Niles, Altamont Pass, Stockton, and finally Sacramento. The Sacramento Northern line simply drilled through the Oakland Hills and headed in the more direct route towards Sacramento by crossing the Suisun Bay at the ferry slip at Mallard. The SN had the most direct line to Sacramento, and its parent WP once considered converting it into an alternate WP line into Oakland. The steep grades in the Oakland Hills and the poor situation using key system tracks to access industries in Oakland eventually caused the plan to fade away. Another plan that never was carried out was to replace the ungainly ferry crossing with a bridge across the bay from Mallard to Chips on the other side. This would have made the SN far more competitive with the Southern Pacific. The Sacramento Northern was once the country's longest electric interurban line, forged together by the union of the Northern Electric and the old Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern lines. The South End system, built as the OANE, represented the last great building of this type of line in California. The brief optimistic flurry of electric railroad building around 1900 was eventually killed off by the rapid rise of the truck, automobile, and paved road. These forces could deprive revenue from short-haul lines such as the OANE. By merging and coming under the banner of larger steam roads, such as the Western Pacific, some of these electric lines were able to serve a renewed and extended purpose, although in a long, slow death by shrinkage. Today, several small pieces of the SN still survive, but as part of the Union Pacific system that bought the Western Pacific and all its feeder lines. The return trip back to Oakland stopped at Moraga to add a freight locomotive on the point. This was to provide braking safety on the steep grade from the tunnel at Havens to 40th and Shafter. 605 was one of the two motors bought by the early OANE to pull passenger trailers. The Sacramento Northern was the 1929 consolidation of the Northern Electric and the San Francisco-Sacramento Railroads, acquired for feeder lines by WP. Under the leadership of Arthur James, the WP added the missing pieces to help generate traffic. The orange lines on the map represent the WP main line. The Sacramento Northern in yellow is traceable to a 1904 trolley line built in Chico, funded by the Diamond Match Company. Ironically, the Match Company was part of the Gould interests at the time. WP and predecessor Northern Electric fought over track locations in 1906 in Marysville. By the 20s, the WP would own the line and bring it into the Sacramento Northern subsidiary. The line from Sacramento down to Oakland, California seems to be more direct than WP's circuitous route, but it had penalties of over 4% grades in the Oakland Hills and a rail ferry ride across the Suisun Bay as a substitute for the bridge that was never built. The SN was a 281-mile line from predecessors that were originally built for passenger operation. All passenger service was phased out by June 1941. SN had built up a healthy freight business by then. The freight operations remained, and the SN would continue to swap trains across the waters at Suisun Bay from the landings built for the Sacramento Northern predecessors. The SN's 1913-built Oakland facility was crammed into about 1.5 square blocks, where freight was exchanged with Key Systems freight operations and later the Oakland terminal. From 40th and Webster Street, we see a Key System transit train running down toward the Oakland shores, past the 40th and Shafter location, and we can see the SN's freight station, office, and car shop in the background. The Key train is taking the tracks also used by SN's passenger trains and freight transfers, as they had a long-term relationship with the Key System. Here's a closer look at the freight station that had a siding to the rear for freight cars and front openings for truck loading when needed. The offices were located in this building, shaped to fit available space. The car repair shop is in the background. The tracks curved off of 40th Street between the office and the tiny triangular depot on a separate piece of pavement. This was the small depot for passenger and baggage use, located on a 2-track curve off of 40th Street. A small interlocking plant was upstairs with 11 levers to control switches. The early plan was to build a larger facility in nearby Rock Ridge, but the local residents organized and blocked the plan, forcing the railroad to be cramped here until the end in 1957, when it was all torn out and reclaimed by urban plans. This view of the yard in the distance is looking down Shafter Avenue, and it shows how close the residential section was to the railroad. The railroad wasn't popular with the locals here. Most of them would never miss the daily freight trains rumbling up and down the street. Just leaving the yard, this freight train is taking Shafter Avenue up to Rock Ridge and the foothills of Oakland. This cab ride in the rear locomotive was in the final days of operation before the track was removed. The last train to leave Oakland was on February 28, 1957, closing out 44 years of electric trains in the Oakland Hills. The typical SN freight train on the south end of the system had a locomotive at each end of the train. We're on the rear locomotive number 653, a 1,000 horsepower GE steeple cab built in the 20s. The 650 class GEs were 5 in number. They were a compact 35 feet long and weighed in at 126,000 pounds. The SN also had a number of Baldwin-built freight units that survived into the 50s that worked this line, as well as switching freight under lease to the Oakland Terminal Railway. Grades in the Oakland Hills exceeded 4%, and they felt better about the safety of push and pull power to prevent trains from breaking in two. Power at both ends also simplified switching at the various industries in Walnut Creek, Concord, Pittsburgh, and Port Chicago. The run through the Oakland Hills past Moraga and out to Walnut Creek had no industries to generate traffic in the later years. Once the WP completed its own connection in Oakland to the Oakland Terminal Yard by laying track down Union Street in 1957, the SN's south end would be drastically cut back. The town of Walnut Creek provided a few locations to switch freight. The SN once handled walnut loads from sidings near the Walnut Creek freight station. By having the locomotive at both ends, the crew can work sidings pointing in either direction. Number 652 was eventually donated to the California Railroad Museum at Rio Vista Junction, California. The trailing unit, number 653, was donated to the Orange Empire Rail Museum in Paris, California, still in operating condition. The identical number 654 was also donated to the California Railroad Museum, where it continues to run for visiting rail fans. These are the only remaining freight locomotives from a large roster. Sadly, the Essens-Baldwins that had offset ends like the Pacific Electric freight motors were all scrapped in the 50s. This fan trip is leaving Concord, California, powered by number 1005, a car built in the teens and sold to the predecessor Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern, and eventually to Key System during World War II. The Bay Area Electric Railroaders Association bought the car in 1951 to be used for fan trips and preservation. The rear car is Salt Lake in Utah number 751, a reminder of an era on the SN that sported luxury parlor cars that could keep passengers in comfort all the way into Oakland. From there, they could continue to San Francisco on a Key System ferry. The fan trip is returning to 40th and Shafter, down Shafter Avenue, crossing College Avenue. The track here is offset to one side from early plans to double-track the line. These plans never materialized due to objections from homeowners along Shafter Avenue. Traffic volume was low enough where it probably never really mattered. The heavier freight trains were more of a problem for residents than the passenger trains. After a stop at the depot, the Sacramento Northern's pre-war trains would take the Key System tracks down 40th Street to the Bridge Rail Yard and continue to the San Francisco side of the bay. When the Bay Bridge was open to rail traffic, an SN train could share the bridge with SP's IER cars and Key System's silver and orange units. The SP and SN trains both ended just before World War II, leaving the bridge rails to Key alone. Even the Key System gave its business to buses by 1958. The loop and terminal building was built to complement the Bay Bridge, and it was a setback for the ferry operators. Passengers and commuters that flowed in and out of this busy terminal had a great transportation system on the west side of the bay too. The SP was nearby with a large station, and the cable cars and the Muni system could take you anywhere within the city. The WP had its headquarters here in a large building in the background showing the WP and Feather sign. The WP had a small isolated amount of track in San Francisco they reached by rail barge. Back on the East Bay side, the Key System ran by the Santa Fe's small yard near Hollis Street. The Santa Fe and the WP were co-owners of the Oakland Terminal switching line, and they had other ways of cooperating to balance the regional near dominance of the powerful Southern Pacific. After the tracks were removed in the Oakland Hills, the isolated part of the Sacramento Northern system gained trackage rights on the Santa Fe from West Pittsburgh to Stockton, and the rail ferry operation was ended, and the expense of it. Diesels had taken over everywhere on the SN except one segment remaining under wire in the Twin Cities of Marysville and Yuba City. The last 3 GE freight motors were there until 1964, when a long-term electric power contract ended with the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. The power had a minimum billing, whether used or not. GE 652 was already partly dismantled to keep sisters 653 and 654 running. The end of any electric Sacramento Northern operation finally came, but not until a few last runs under wire, this trip being made in a San Francisco Muni car number 178, which is about as far from home as it's ever been. It gave riders one last look at what streetcar service was like before it ended on the Sacramento Northern's Yuba City line in 1942. This car now resides at the California Railroad Museum in Rio Vista Junction.